Hi, I'm Helen from Helen Kennedy Designs, and today's video we're going to be working the Always Be Brave shawl in sock weight yarn. Now hopefully you're going to be making a full-size shawl, but I'm just going to be making a little sampler, and I'm going to use this to demonstrate the key points. So I'm going to start with the first couple of sections, and I'm going to knit these in real time so that even if you've never knitted a shawl before, you could knit along with me and start knitting this shawl. And it's a very simple repeat, so you soon get the hang of it, even if you're quite new to shawl knitting. I'm going to show you how to carry the yarn up the sides of your work so we're not breaking these yarns, and how to make these really neat and tidy slip stitches so we get this nice bubble pattern. The next key section I'll be working on then will be this section where we transition from having the bubbles as the pattern and the grey as the background to having the coloured yarn as the background and the grey as the bubbles. So you can see we've reversed the colourways there. And then at the end of the shawl, how to work the final section and the bind off. In this case, I've worked a garter stitch section at the end to stop the shawl from curling before doing my I-cord bind off. But the other possibility, at least in the pattern, of course there are many if you want to make your own, is to finish with a stockinette section, a few rows of garter stitch, and then this Icelandic bind off, which creates a really nice edge to the shawl. So I'm going to knit this little sampler. I'm going to get together my supplies. If you knit along with me, or you knit this pattern at all, I would love to hear from you in the comments below if you've any questions or comments for me, and I can get back to you. And also consider liking and subscribing so that you'll see my new videos as they're released. So I'll get my supplies together and I'll meet you back there. So I've assembled everything I need for my little sampler that I'm going to make to demonstrate how to make this shawl. You can find this pattern on Ravelry and it's listed at £5, but I have displayed a number of codes there for you to use so that you can download it for a variety of different prices, from free to full price and a few price points in between. So you can pay whatever works for you. So go ahead and download the pattern if you need a PDF copy. Otherwise, you can just follow along with this video. So what we're doing is we're making it in a sock weight yarn, and I'm using here Malabrigo Machita, which is a sock weight yarn with a single ply, and it's a really beautifully soft yarn against the skin. And I've chosen these two colours because they're very contrasting. One is light and one is darker. This is a solid coloured yarn, and this is a very variegated yarn which gives some beautiful colours as you knit through the stitches. But the skeins themselves don't share any colours in common at all. And that's quite important if you want the pattern to stand out well and be really crisp. So we're going to start with our main colour. So we're going to put the coloured yarn to the side, and we're going to be using a 3.75mm needle. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit for you. I'm using these cords that swivel and metal needle tips because I like the way they work with sock weight yarn. And when you've got a lot of stitches, you can sort of fly along with metal needles. I'll put any links in the description below. So let's take a look at our pattern. So I'm going to work the setup section, and this is a relatively short section of 13 rows, and you can work this along with me because I'm going to work this in real time. So first of all, we want to use our main colour, which in this case is pearl, and we're going to cast on 5 stitches using your preferred method. So my preferred method is the long tail cast on. So I've got a little bit of a tail in my hand here. It doesn't need to be much. It's only 5 stitches. Then I'm going to make the first loop just by twisting the yarn onto the needle, and then I'm going to cast on 4 more stitches. Not too tightly. We don't want to work anything too tightly in our patterns. So that's our 5 stitches. Now as I work, I'm going to move my pattern out of the way a little bit to give some contrast. But the first row, row 1, is going to be a wrong side row, and it's a knit. Now as a little tip, what I do is when I'm starting my work or I've got a new yarn I'm joining in, I tend to grab my yarn tail and tuck it up out of the way in my left hand. So first row, knit all your stitches. I'm going to go quite slowly so that you can follow along. And that's our first row complete. Then we're going to turn our work over, and this will actually be the right side of our work. We're going to row 2 on the right side, and this is where our stitch count is going to change. And I have had 1 or 2 people emailing in thinking that this stitch count is incorrect, but it's not, and I'll show you how to work this. So it's knit 1, knit front to back to front, knit 2 together, knit 1. Just going to slip the pattern out of the way, and I'm going to zoom in very slightly to show you this a little bit closer up so that we can avoid any confusion about the stitch counts and the increases. So we're going to start with our knit 1, and then we're going to knit into the next stitch, and we're going to knit into the front leg of the stitch. Don't drop the stitch off, then go in and find the back leg of the stitch. Don't drop it off, go back into the front leg of the stitch. And what I hope you can now see is that we've got our original knit stitch, and then we've got our increase here, which now consists of 3 stitches. We started with 1 stitch, we've gone in the front, the back and the front, so we've made 3 stitches. So we have an extra 2 stitches. Then we're going to knit 2 together. If this is a little bit tight, then just work in with your tips. And then a final knit 1. And you should have 6 stitches. 2, 4, 6. Because this increase gives you an extra 2 stitches. And this decrease takes away 1. Then if we pop back and look at the pattern, we can see that our row 3, which is our wrong side, is again just a simple knit all stitches. So nothing too difficult. Then we're going to turn back to the right side. We're going to do another row that changes our stitch count. And again, we're going to go up by 1 stitch because we're going to work both an increase and a decrease, but we'll end up with an extra stitch. So knit 1, knit into the front of the stitch, don't drop it off, knit into the back of the stitch, don't drop it off, go back again into the front of the stitch. As you do it, make sure you pull enough yarn up into these loops. Stretch a bit of yarn in because you don't want these to be really super tight. Then we've got knit 1, and then we're at the last 3 stitches where we can do a knit 2 together and knit 1. Quick count our stitches, 2, 4, 6, 7. Now we're going to turn our work over again, and this time we're going to start using purling in our pattern. Now if you really hate to purl, you can do all knitting so that the pattern is completely in garter stitch, but I like the way it looks in stockinette stitch, and it helps the bubble stitch to sort of stand out. So I'm going to work it completely as written in the pattern. So I'm going to knit 2, then purl 3, and knit 2. Of course, there's no change in our stitch count there. Turn our work over, and now we're going to work row 6, and again we're going to be changing our stitch count, again increasing by 1 stitch. So we're going to knit 1, then we're going to make our increase, so we're going to knit into the front. Make sure you pull enough yarn up into the loop, knit into the back, pulling enough yarn up into the loop, and knit into the front again. Then knit to the last 3 stitches, and then do your knit 2 together and knit 1. And now we should have 8 stitches. 2, 4, 6, 8. Now we've turned our work onto the wrong side, and we're going to knit the first 2 and the last 2 stitches and purl everything in between. So knit 2, those are our edge stitches. Then we're going to purl to the last 2 stitches. So in this case we're purling 4, and then we're going to knit the last 2 edge stitches. Of course there's no change in stitch count, so back to our right side, and we're on to row 8, and again you can see it's a row where we make increase and decreases, and again we're going to be going up just by 1 stitch. So with the same pattern, knit 1, increase, knit to the last 3 stitches, knit 2 together, knit 1. So knit the first stitch, knit into the front, then the back, and then the front for our increase. Then we're going to knit 3 stitches, and then we're going to do our knit 2 together, knit 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 stitches. Turn your work to the wrong side, and again knit the 2 edge stitches at either end of the row and purl the stitches in between. Oops, just caught a bit of the yarn there. So that's the wrong side row completed. Now we're moving on to row 10. And row 10 is a little different because it's beginning to get towards what will become the established pattern of increases and decreases. So on row 10, I'm going to knit 1, knit front to back to front as we have before, but this time we're not going to do any knit 2 together, we're just going to knit to the end. And because we're not making that decrease, we're going to go up by 2 stitches to 11 stitches. So knit 1, knit into the front, into the back and into the front for our increase, and then simply knit to the end. And then we'll do a quick stitch count: 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, because we've got no decrease, remember, at this edge. Then we're going to turn our work over to the wrong side, and just as before, we're going to do our knit 2 edge stitches and then purl to the last 2 stitches, and then we're going to knit 2. Turn our work to the right side. We're going to do our right side row, row 12, and we've gone back now where we make a knit 2 together at the end of the row. So knit 1, make our increase, knit along to the last 3 stitches, knit 2 together, knit 1, and your stitch count goes up by 1 stitch because we've both increased and decreased. So let's work that. We've got knit, knit front to back to front, then we're going to knit the last 3, and then we're going to do our knit 2 together and knit 1. And you can just begin to see the shape of the shawl coming now. And then we've got our final row of the setup, and just as before, we knit 2 stitches at the beginning and the end of the row and purl everything in between. So knit 2, purl to the last 2 stitches, and then knit 2. And that's the little setup section of our shawl finished. And now we're going to go on to the body of shawl section 1. Now you can either follow the written instructions or you can follow the chart, which is at the top of the page, and I'm actually going to follow the chart. So work the chart a total of 20 times. Obviously I'm only making a tiny sampler shawl, so I'm not going to be working it 20 times. But what I will do is work it a couple of times just to go through how you do all of these stitches and bring in your yarns and make tidy slip stitches. It's worth noting that there's always an increase as the second stitch on every right side row. It's knit 1 and then make your knit front to back to front, but your decreases don't always happen. If you think about this chart being 2 sections of 6 rows, then the middle 2 rows of each of those sections don't have a knit 2 together, if that helps you remember or keep track. So you'll see that the first 6 rows of the chart are continuing in our main colour yarn. So I'm going to now work these 6 rows. So we can knit 1, knit front to back to front, knit to the last 3 stitches, then work our decrease, knit 2 together and knit 1. And then we can turn our work over, and as before we knit our edge stitches and purl everything in between. So we're going to knit 2, purl to the last 2 stitches, and then we're going to knit the last 2 stitches because those are our edge stitches. I'm a little bit slow because it's quite hard trying to knit close up on camera. So that's our wrong side row. So we're going to turn to the right side, and you can see that we're now getting this nice stockinette section in the middle, and we've got some garter stitch borders. On row 3 we're not going to be having our decrease at the end. Knit 1, make our increase by knitting front to back to front, and then simply knit along. Now our wrong side row is just as it was before, knitting 2 stitches at the beginning and the end of the row, and then simply purling the ones in between. So obviously no change in stitch count for the wrong side row. So knit the last 2 stitches and then turn your work over. Then we're going to knit row 5, and we're going to knit our increase, and this time we are going to knit 2 together at the end of the row. So knit along to the last 3 stitches, knit 2 together, knit 1. So just as before, knit the first stitch, make, I've just caught a bit of yarn there, make our increase, knit along to the last 3 stitches, and then knit 2 together and knit the final stitch. Flip over and do our wrong side row with our 2 knit stitches and our purl stitches in between our edge stitches. So knit 2, purl to the last 2 stitches, and then that will be our main colour part, the first 6 rows of that chart finished. So there we go. So we've completed our first 6 rows, and you'll now notice that we're going to be bringing in our contrast yarn. Knit 1, make our increase, knit to the last 3 stitches, knit 2 together and knit 1, but we're going to be doing it in a contrast colour yarn. And how I do this is to join in my yarn is I lay the yarn tail in my left hand and hold it at the back of my work so that I don't start knitting with it, because I frequently do and it's very annoying. So I've learnt to tuck it away in my left hand so I can't use it. And then we simply just start knitting. So knit one, make our increase just as we have before, knit to the last 3 stitches, and then we make our little decrease, which helps to shape our shawl. So we knit 2 together and knit 1, and that's our first contrast colour row started. You can let go of the yarn tail now. I'm likely to start working with it now. So turn your work over and you can see that row 8, the second row in our contrast colour yarn, is actually all knit stitches, and this creates a really nice little textured row which really stands out in the pattern. So we're going to just knit across. And as a reminder, if I'm going too slow, you can always speed up using the little wheel on the YouTube video. You can speed me all the way up to 2 times faster. I'd probably sound like a chipmunk if you do that, but that's fine. Or you can just work along with me. So that's our 2 contrast colour rows. Now we're going to swap back to our main colour, so don't break the yarn. We don't want lots of yarn tails to tie in, and it's completely unnecessary. We're going to carry our yarns most of the time for this shawl. And I'm going to show you the method that I use for carrying my yarn. So whatever I have just been working with, whatever colour that may be, I put it to the front of my work, tuck it out of the way, and I then put my needle on top of the yarn that I want to use next, which in this case is my grey yarn. So I put my needle on top so that the yarn's at the back. I slip the first stitch purlwise and then bring that yarn between the 2 needles and to the front of the work and slip my stitch back. And then I want to work my row, and this is the first row where we're going to encounter our slip stitches. And I've got a tip for you here on how to work really tidy slip stitches. You should always use this method, whatever slip stitch knitting you're doing, and you'll find that your slip stitches are much tidier. If you have any problem with your slip stitches elongating, this is the way to do it. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can show you this in detail. So we're going to knit our first stitch, we're going to knit our increase, and then I'm going to take a quick look at the pattern, and I see I've got 1 more stitch to knit before my slip stitches. So knit that stitch. Now, slip stitches, you do not want to disturb these stitches. You don't want to insert your needle and pull them off your knitting needle. What you want to do is, supporting the stitches with your finger, put your needles as much as you can tip to tip, and just on the very tips, the slimmest part of your needles, just slip those stitches across so they remain completely undisturbed. Then we're going to knit 6. No need to carry this yarn loosely across the back. You can just have it reasonably tight. So knit 6 stitches, and then we're going to slip another 2 stitches. So get your needles aligned tip to tip, and even just slightly drop your stitches off the needle and onto the new one without inserting your needles together, because when you put your needle into a stitch you're automatically enlarging it because you've got 2 needles in it. And when you're slipping your stitches, you want to keep them as small as possible. So slip 2 and then just knit to the end, there's no decrease. So we've slipped our 2 stitches, so it's knit 4. So then we turn our work over and work our way back, and it's exactly as all of our other wrong side rows have been in this main colour yarn so far. We've got our knit 2 at either end. We've got purls in between, except for where we're going to slip the stitches. And these will be really easy to see because they're going to be in our coloured yarn. So you don't need to worry that you won't know which ones to slip, because they're going to be extremely obvious. So we're going to start with our knit 2. We're going to purl our grey stitches, and then we're going to come across our coloured stitches, and just as before, tip to tip, as little disturbing as possible, move those stitches across and then continue purling. It's a little bit tricky because sometimes your main colour stitch on the other side of them can be in the way because this is tight, but just bring them right, even if you have to just like drop them off onto your needle, that works beautifully. So make it to your last 2 stitches and then knit those. Then we're going to swap back to our contrast colour yarn here, and again we've got our increase, some slip stitches, and knit to the last 3 and do our knit 2 together, knit 1. And as before, take whatever yarn you were working with and hold it at the front. Find the yarn that you want to work with, not your yarn tail, and put your needle on top of it, like so. Slip the first stitch of the row purlwise and bring that yarn you want to work with between the 2 stitches. Pop that stitch back on and then just get ready for knitting. So then we're going to knit 1, knit our increase, and then we're going to knit the slip stitches, and again it's obvious because you're going to knit the stitches that are in grey, and then you're going to come across your coloured stitches, and again those are the ones we want to be slipping. This is the last time we're going to slip them. So knit across to the next set of slip stitches. Then tip to tip, disturbing them as little as possible. Knit the last 3 stitches and then work your knit 2 together and knit 1. Then we're going to turn our work, and just like before for our textured row, we're going to knit all the way across, including knitting those slip stitches. So we're just going to knit all the way across. So our 2 little edge stitches, which are normally knit, we don't need to worry about that because we're just knitting all the way across. And you can see that I'm knitting across my slip stitches, which, because I'm using a variegated yarn, they're still quite obvious because they're in the colour from a few rows back. You can see that they're the bright orange ones here. If you're not using a variegated yarn, they might be slightly less obvious, but it doesn't matter because you're just going to knit them. Okay, we're not doing anything special with those, and I highly recommend knitting them just with the tips of your needles rather than going all the way into the stitch like that, to just work on the tips, because that keeps your stitches from stretching out. So I'm just going to zoom out a bit. So there we have our first pattern repeat. You can see that we've got a section of grey, and then we've got our contrast colour yarn, our slip stitches, and then our contrast colour yarn. Now you're going to, if you want to make a full-size shawl, you're going to repeat this a total of 20 times. I'm not, because I'm only going to knit a tiny little sampler, so I'm going to go ahead and work 2 more repeats, and I will meet you at the point at which we move on to the next section of the shawl. I'm only making a little tiny sample shawl here, and so I'm going to finish with chart section 1 and move on to the pattern transition. I've got my cup of coffee here ready for my knitting as well. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so we can see the instructions. In this section, as the pattern says, we're going to be reversing our colours. So we will, in the middle of this section, break our yarn, and I'll show you where. But to start with, what we're going to do is work 3 rows in our main colour yarn. And it's 3 rows that are exactly the same 3 rows as in chart 1. So just as before, we're going to put our working yarn to the side out of the way there. We're going to go on top of our grey yarn and slip a stitch purlwise, bring that grey yarn between the needles to the front of the work and slip that stitch back, and then I'm just going to start working in the pattern. Now I'm not going to work this in real time because you will have a lot of stitches on your needle, and of course I'm only making a miniature shawl, so I only have a very few. So what I'll do is I'll work these 3 rows, and that does mean that we'll be finishing with a right side row, and when I've completed them I will join you there. So I finished my 3 rows, so I'm at the end of my right side row, and the pattern does tell you to break your coloured yarn. Also now I can break my contrast, my main colour yarn. So now we're going to turn to the wrong side of our work, and I'm going to tuck that tail out of the way, and I'm going to tuck my contrast colour yarn tail out of the way, and then I'm just going to start knitting with my coloured yarn. Now this is a row 4, so we're going to knit our first 2 edge stitches, but then we are going to go back to purling all the way along the length of the row to the last 2 stitches where we do our knit 2, and then we're going to work row 5 and row 6 in our contrast colour yarn, and I will meet you back at that point. So that's my 3 rows of main colour and 3 rows of contrast colour knitted, and we're now going to, with our right side facing, rejoin our main colour and start working those textured bubble stitch rows, this time in our main colour yarn. So again, holding the yarn tail across the front of the work so I can't be working with it, I'm going to do the usual pattern: knit 1, knit front back to front, knit to the last 3 stitches, knit 2 together and knit 1. So this is simply just as we've done before, but with our yarn colours reversed. So what I'll do is I'll finish these 6 rows with our little bubble stitch, and I'll show you how it looks, and then I'll show you how to work the final section of the shawl. So there we have it. This is the transition section. We've got our 3 rows of main colour, and then we've swapped colours so that our background colour is now our coloured yarn, and our main colour is forming these textured rows in our little sort of bubble stitch, these little rounds that you create on this shawl. So that's the transition section, and now essentially all you're going to be doing is continuing to work your shawl exactly as before, except for your colours are reversed. So this chart is exactly the same but with the colours reversed, and it says to, if you're making a full size shawl, to work the chart a total of 7 times. Obviously, as before, we're carrying our yarns up, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work this chart twice, and then I'm going to join you for the final rows to show you how to prevent your shawl from curling and how to do your contrasting bind off. So we have worked rows 1 to 12 of section 2 a total of 7 times. Well, actually I've only worked it twice, but you'll have worked it 7 times. So we have our transition section and then our section 2. And if you just count these main colour rows here, you should have 8 of those. 1 from the transition section and 7 from section 2 of your shawl. So the stitch counts are here for you, and then you have a choice of ending. If you want an I-cord bind off, then we're going to break our main colour yarn now. If you want to go for an Icelandic bind off, so a few rows of garter and then Icelandic bind off, we're going to continue carrying the main colour yarn. I'm going to be demonstrating the I-cord bind off, so I'm going to break my main colour yarn now so that it doesn't get in my way, and then for either bind off we work rows 1 to 6 once more and then break our contrast colour yarn. Now these 1 to 6 rows you can work them in stockinette stitch, but if you're doing an I-cord bind off and you want to prevent curling, then I recommend you work them in garter stitch. They look great in a variegated yarn. So just continue with rows 1 to 6 but worked in garter stitch. So as before, we have our increase and decrease pattern. So continue with your standard pattern of increases and decreases, just work the 6 rows in garter stitch. So I'll do that, and then I'll meet you back when we're ready to start the I-cord bind off. So here's my 6 rows of garter stitch, which will prevent end of the shawl from curling up when we've put our I-cord bind off on. If the switch from stockinette to garter stitch bothers you, then I suggest you go for a stockinette section and an Icelandic bind off. But I'm totally fine with this. I actually quite like the fact that there's a little change here, and I think in the variegated yarn it really doesn't matter, but it's your personal choice. So we've finished with a right side row, and now to create a really nice bind off in the I-cord, because we're swapping colours, if you were continuing in your coloured yarn, then you could just start with your I-cord bind off. But because we're switching colours and it's quite a strong colour switch, and I want mine to look really tidy, then what we're going to do is turn our work to the wrong side, and we're going to work a wrong side row. Okay, so we've just worked a wrong side row in our coloured yarn. We're going to work another one, but we're going to work it in our main colour yarn. So again, holding that yarn tail out of the way, and we're going to work it in stockinette. So we're going to knit our 2 edge stitches, and then we're going to purl all the way back to the last 2 stitches, and then we'll knit those last 2 stitches. I'll finish off here and I'll meet you as we turn around for our I-cord bind off. So that's it, that's our last 2 stitches, and we're going to knit those, and I'm just going to snug down that yarn tail, and then we're going to turn our work. Now, an I-cord bind off is usually 3 stitches. You can do it with 2 stitches, but I'm going to do a 3 stitch I-cord bind off because I want it to be kind of quite substantial. So we're going to start by casting on, using the knitted cast on, 3 stitches. So that's 1, 2, 3. So we've got 3 additional stitches, and now we're going to use these 3 stitches for our bind off. So what we do is we knit the first 2. If you're doing a 2 stitch bind off, you'd only knit the first 1, and then you're going to knit one of your stitches and one of your edge stitches together through the back loops. Now I find it tricky, particularly at the beginning, to get just straight into the back loops. So I go into the front loops, like so, and then kind of slip my needle to the back. That's just if you find it tricky though. I'm going to drop my yarn off. The first few stitches are often the trickiest as you start anything in knitting. So then, purl wise, we're going to slip them back onto our left needle, so we don't want to be twisting them, and we're just going to repeat that process. So we're going to knit 2 stitches, and then we're going to knit 2 together through the back loops, and it's got a bit easier to go straight into the back loops now that I've done 1 stitch already. So you've passed your stitches back onto your left needle purlwise, and then knit 2 together through the back loops, back onto the left needle, and just repeat that process. I'll do it a couple more times just so that you can do it along with me if you've not done this before. Knit 2, knit 2 together through the back loops, and of course that knit 2 together through the back loops is what's actually binding off a stitch on your edge. So you can see that as we do that, we're progressing along our edge because we're taking one of these stitches away each time. So I'm going to continue that all the way along, and I'll meet you just as I'm finishing my bind off. So I'm here now at my final 4 stitches, 3 from my I-cord and 1 from my edge, and we're just going to work the I-cord, knitting 2 together through the back loops, and then you have no stitches left on your left needle, but pass your 3 stitches back onto your left needle, and then what I like to do to finish off is to bind all 3 stitches off together through the back loop to make the little ending, and then you can pull your yarn through and break your yarn tail there. There we go, and that's the I-cord finished, and you can see it makes a really nice contrast colour edge to your shawl. And I think the switch between the stockinette and the garter stitch at the end is quite subtle when you're working with a variegated yarn. I'm going to quickly show you how I like to weave my yarn tails into my knitting so that they are nicely hidden. And I like to use, I hope you can see, this little tapestry needle that's got sort of turned up end. So I thread my tail that I want to sew in onto my tapestry needle there. And then what I want to do is try and follow the course of this coloured yarn, so my grey yarn, but stretching over a few rows. It's hard to do it just in one row, so what I tend to do is follow it. So I'm going to point with my needle, hopefully you'll be able to see that if you come through here, then you could guide up to here, back through, back up to here, and you are going across a few rows there. You're not simply going up and down in one row, so you must try and keep your tension fairly loose, but what it does allow you to do is to tuck that yarn nicely away, hiding it sort of in the course of, you know, roughly where it can go without showing. And this doesn't show particularly on the back, and it doesn't show on the front at all. So that's how I do it, and I make sure before I cut my yarn tail when I'm doing this. So I'm only going to do a few stitches, so I take my needle off and I'm going to do a little pull in both directions, because this is going over a few rows in height, and what you don't want is to cinch it down tightly, because that'll pucker your work at the front. And then what I'm going to do is simply trim off that yarn tail. And this is a single ply, so I give the tail a little flick there and it just sort of disappears. And then you can't see that on the front of the work, and it's very tidy as well on the back of the work. So that's how I do my yarn tails. We have a few because we've switched coloured yarns, so I'm going to work all of my yarn tails in, and I'm going to block my shawl, and then I'll show you the final result. So here are my final samples. Here's the one I've demonstrated with the garter stitch border and the I-cord edging, and in good Blue Peter fashion, one I made earlier with a stockinette section and then a garter stitch section and an Icelandic bind off, and I'll just zoom in a touch so you can see those. So I hope you've really enjoyed knitting along with me in this tutorial and that you've enjoyed making your shawl. Please feel free to like, subscribe and comment, and happy knitting.